The crystal chandeliers of L'Escalates Doré cast fractured rainbows across the white marble floors, each prism of light dancing like accusations across the polished surface. It was 7:47 p.m. on a Thursday evening in late September, and the restaurant hummed with the particular frequency of wealth. The soft clink of silverware against bone china, the whispered negotiations of deals worth more than most people would earn in lifetimes, the rustle of silk and cashmere moving through air-conditioned perfection. Outside, Manhattan's Upper East Side glittered with the kind of beauty that only money could buy. But inside L'Escalates Doré, something far more expensive was about to shatter. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Marcus Hale stood near table 7, his 6'3" frame rigid with the kind of tension that made junior executives flinch and board members choose their words carefully. His suit was Italian, charcoal gray with pinstripes so subtle they seemed like shadows, and his silver cufflinks caught the light with every movement of his hands. At 52, Marcus had built Hale Industries from a single construction contract into a billion-dollar empire, spanning real estate, tech investments, and international development. He had shaken hands with presidents, negotiated with princes, and never, not once in 30 years, accepted lateness as anything other than disrespect. His watch read 7:47. Their reservation was for 7:30. 17 minutes. 17 minutes of his life wasted because some incompetent waitress couldn't manage to show up on time. "Where is our server?" Marcus asked Andrew Chen, the restaurant's manager, who had appeared at the table with the practiced smile of someone accustomed to managing difficult situations. Andrew was 41, a career hospitality professional who had worked his way up from busboy to manager over 2 decades. He knew every regular customer by name, remembered dietary restrictions without being reminded, and could defuse tensions with the kind of grace that seemed effortless but was actually the result of thousands of hours of practice. "Mr. Hale, I sincerely apologize for the delay. Your server will be with you momentarily. Can I offer you and Mrs. Hale a complimentary bottle of wine while you wait? Perhaps the 2015 Chateau Margaux." Marcus's wife, Evelyn, touched his arm gently. She was 50, elegant in a navy dress that cost more than some cars, her auburn hair swept back to reveal pearl earrings that had belonged to her grandmother. Evelyn had been married to Marcus for 28 years, and she had learned to read the particular set of his jaw that meant he was building toward an explosion. She had also learned, over those same years, that sometimes those explosions needed to happen, that her husband carried weights she couldn't always see. "Marcus," she said quietly, "it's fine. We're not in a hurry." But Marcus was always in a hurry. Time was the only resource he couldn't manufacture, couldn't negotiate for, couldn't acquire no matter how much money he threw at it. Every minute was an investment, and wasted minutes were losses he felt in his chest like physical pain. "It's not fine," he said, his voice low but hard. "We made a reservation. We showed up on time. That's how civilized society functions, Evelyn. People honor their commitments." Across the restaurant, through the swinging doors that led to the kitchen, a young woman was running. Her name was Sophie Martinez, and she was 23 years old, and she was running because she was late, because the train had broken down, because her phone had died so she couldn't call ahead, because her younger brother had needed help with his homework before she left, because life had a way of making everything harder than it needed to be. Sophie burst through the employee entrance at 7:49 p.m., her dark hair escaping from its ponytail, her white server's blouse slightly wrinkled from being stuffed in her bag during the subway ride. She'd been working at L'Escalates Doré for 6 months, and she had never been late before. Not once. She prided herself on that. But today, today had been impossible. "Sophie," Maria Rodriguez, the head server, grabbed her arm as she rushed past. She was 56, a woman who had raised 3 children while working double shifts, who had calluses on her feet from decades of standing and a warmth in her eyes that made new servers feel less alone. "Table 7 has been waiting. Mr. Hale, you need to be careful with this one." I know, I'm so sorry," Sophie gasped, tying her apron with shaking fingers. "The train."
"I don't care about the train," Maria said, not unkindly. "Right now, you need to breathe, put on your smile, and go take care of that table. And Sophie, whatever he says, don't take it personally. Men like that, they're not really angry at you. They're angry at something else. You're just the target." Sophie nodded, grabbed her order pad, and pushed through the kitchen doors into the dining room. The chandelier light hit her like a spotlight, and for a moment she felt exposed, vulnerable, like everyone in the restaurant could see how she didn't belong here, how she was just pretending to be competent and professional when really she was terrified and exhausted and so late. She walked toward table 7, and that's when Marcus Hale saw her. He saw the lateness first, not in minutes, but in the rushed way she moved, the slight breathlessness, the evidence of someone who had failed to plan properly. He saw a young woman who clearly didn't understand the value of other people's time. He saw exactly the kind of carelessness that he had spent his entire life fighting against. But Evelyn saw something different. She saw a girl, because at 50, 23 looked impossibly young, who was clearly trying her best. She saw the fear in Sophie's eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly as she approached. She saw someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone who was probably doing this job because she needed it, not because she wanted it. "Good evening," Sophie said, her voice steadier than she felt. She had practiced this greeting 1,000 times, had perfected the tone that was warm but not familiar, professional but not cold. "My name is Sophie, and I'll be taking care of you tonight. I apologize for the delay." 18 minutes, Marcus interrupted, his voice cutting through her apology like a blade. "We've been sitting here for 18 minutes without so much as a glass of water." Sophie's throat tightened. "I understand, sir, and I'm very sorry. Can I start you off with, do you have any idea how much my time is worth?" Marcus leaned forward, and his eyes, steel gray, the kind of eyes that had stared down corporate raiders and hostile board members, fixed on her with an intensity that made her want to disappear. 18 minutes. At my hourly rate, you've just cost me approximately $3,000. That's more than you make in a week, I'd wager. "Marcus," Evelyn said, her voice sharp now, "that's enough." But it wasn't enough, because something in Marcus had broken open, some reservoir of frustration that had nothing to do with this girl but had found her anyway. He thought about the board meeting that morning where Richard Chen had questioned his judgment on the Singapore project. He thought about the call from his daughter Jennifer, who still wasn't speaking to him after their argument about her dropping out of business school. He thought about his son. And that's when he saw it. On Sophie's left wrist, just visible beneath the cuff of her white sleeve, was a watch. Not just any watch. A Patek Philippe Nautilus with a distinctive blue face and a scratch on the bezel at the 2 o'clock position. A scratch that Marcus knew intimately because he had watched it happen, had watched his son Daniel drop the watch on the driveway 3 years ago, had watched the boy's face crumble with shame and fear. The watch Daniel was wearing the day he disappeared. The blood drained from Marcus's face. The restaurant noise faded to white static. His hand shot out across the table, grabbing Sophie's wrist with a force that made her cry out in surprise and fear. "Where did you get that watch?" His voice was no longer loud. It was quiet, deadly, shaking with something that went beyond anger into territory that had no name. "Where did you get it?" Sophie tried to pull away, but his grip was iron. Other diners were turning now, the bubble of privacy that money usually bought dissolving as the scene escalated. Andrew Chen was already moving toward the table, and Maria had emerged from the kitchen, her face tight with concern.
"Sir, please let go of me," Sophie said, trying to keep her voice professional even as panic clawed at her throat. "You're hurting me." "That watch belonged to my son," Marcus said, and now Evelyn was standing too, her hand on his shoulder, her face pale with shock because she had recognized it too. "My son who disappeared 3 years ago, my son who was wearing that exact watch the last time anyone saw him alive. So I'll ask you again, where the hell did you get it?" The dining room had gone silent, 50 people holding their breath, watching a billionaire accuse a waitress of something that nobody quite understood yet, but everyone could feel was terrible and important and about to change everything. Sophie's eyes filled with tears, not from the pain of his grip, but from the accusation in his voice, from the weight of whatever story was crushing him. "A pawn shop," she whispered. "I bought it at a pawn shop in Queens 6 months ago. I saved for 3 months to afford it. It was for my brother. It's his birthday next week, and he's obsessed with watches, and I thought, which pawn shop?" Marcus released her wrist, but his intensity hadn't diminished. If anything, it had doubled. "Which one? When exactly?" "Marcus, you're scaring her," Evelyn said, but her own voice was shaking because hope was a dangerous thing, and it had been 3 years since they'd felt it. Andrew Chen reached the table. "Mr. Hale, I'm going to have to ask you to—" "Don't," Marcus said, not looking at him. "Don't ask me to do anything. My son has been missing for 3 years. The police said he probably ran away, that he was an adult and had the right to disappear. But he wouldn't. He wouldn't have left without saying goodbye. And that watch? He would never have pawned that watch. I gave it to him for his 18th birthday. He wore it every single day." Sophie was crying now, her professional composure completely shattered. "Lou's pawn shop on Roosevelt Avenue. I bought it in March. I have the receipt at home. I kept it because it was so much money, and I wanted to make sure—" She stopped, looking down at the watch on her wrist as if seeing it for the first time, as if understanding suddenly that this beautiful thing she'd been so proud of buying was actually a piece of someone's tragedy, a clue in a story that had been searching for its ending. "I didn't know," she said softly. "I swear to God, I didn't know." Marcus sat down heavily, as if his legs had stopped working. Evelyn's hand found his shoulder, and her other hand covered her mouth, and in that moment they looked like what they were. Parents who had lost a child and had learned to live with that loss, but had never accepted it, never stopped hoping for the phone call that would change everything. Maria approached the table carefully, as if approaching a bomb that might detonate. "Mr. and Mrs. Hale, why don't we move you to the private dining room? Sophie, honey, you come too. Andrew, can you bring water and call the police?" "No," Marcus said sharply, then softer. "No, no police. Not yet. I need to understand this first." He looked at Sophie, really looked at her for the first time since she'd approached the table. Saw a young woman who was terrified and crying and clutching a watch that she'd bought legitimately, innocently, not knowing it was evidence in a missing person case that had gone cold after 6 months of investigation. Saw someone who was probably going to be traumatized by this moment for the rest of her life. "I'm sorry," he said, and the words seemed to cost him something. "I'm sorry I grabbed you. I'm sorry I yelled. But you have to understand, that watch is the first new information we've had in 3 years. 3 years of nothing. No calls, no sightings, no body, no answers. Just silence. Just wondering every single day if my son is alive or dead. If he ran away or if something terrible happened, if we failed him somehow, if there was something we should have noticed, something we should have done differently." His voice broke on the last word, and Evelyn's hand tightened on his shoulder, and Sophie saw, truly saw, the depth of their pain for the first time. "I'll help you," Sophie said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "However I can help, I'll do it. I'll take you to the pawn shop. I'll show you the receipt. I'll tell you everything I remember about buying it. I'll give it back to you, right now, if it might help you find your son." She started to unbuckle the watch, but Marcus stopped her with a gentle hand, so different from the grip of moments before. "No," he said, "keep it, until we know more. It's evidence, And if you take it off, we might miss something. DNA, fingerprints, I don't know. I don't know how any of this works." He looked at his wife, and something passed between them. A communication built over decades of marriage, of shared joy and shared loss, of decisions made together in the face of impossible choices. "We need to talk," Evelyn said to Sophie. "Not here, not like this, but soon. Tonight, if possible. Would you be willing to meet us after your shift? We'll pay you for your time, of course. We'll pay you whatever you need." Sophie thought about her brother waiting at home, about the math homework he'd been struggling with, about her mother who worked the night shift at the hospital and wouldn't be back until morning. She thought about how she'd been late today, how she might lose this job over it, how she couldn't afford to lose this job. But she also thought about the look in Marcus Hale's eyes, about the 3 years of searching and not finding, about how she would feel if it were her brother who had disappeared, if someone had information that might help and refused to share it. "My shift ends at midnight," she said, "but I could meet you before that. I could tell my manager it's an emergency." Which I guess it is. Andrew Chen had been hovering nearby, uncertain how to handle a situation that had veered so far outside the boundaries of normal restaurant problems. "Sophie," he said carefully, "if you need to go, go. We'll figure it out." Maria squeezed Sophie's shoulder. "I'll cover your tables. You do what you need to do." And so, 15 minutes later, Sophie Martinez found herself sitting in the private dining room of Le Ciel Doré with Marcus and Evelyn Hale, an untouched glass of water in front of her and a watch on her wrist that had suddenly become the most important object in the room. "Tell us about Daniel," Sophie said softly, because she understood that before they talked about pawn shops and receipts and timelines, they needed to talk about the person at the center of all this. "Tell me about your son." Marcus looked at Evelyn, and she nodded, and he pulled out his phone and scrolled through photos until he found one that made his breath catch in his throat the way it did every single time he looked at it. The photo showed a young man, 21 years old, with his father's height and his mother's warm eyes. Daniel Hale was smiling at the camera, dressed in a Columbia University sweatshirt, standing in front of the campus library with autumn leaves scattered around his feet. On his left wrist, clearly visible in the photo, was the watch that Sophie was now wearing. "He was studying economics," Evelyn said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "He wanted to go into sustainable development, to use business principles to help communities in poverty. He was idealistic. Too idealistic, maybe. He used to argue with Marcus about corporate responsibility, about whether making money and doing good were compatible. We argued," Marcus said, staring at the photo. "God, we argued. So much, about everything. He thought I was too focused on profit, too willing to compromise my principles. I thought he was naive, that he didn't understand how the real world worked. Last conversation. The last time I saw him, we fought about a development project in Ecuador. He said I was destroying indigenous communities for profit. I said he didn't have enough experience to judge complex situations. He left angry. He left so angry. That was June 15th, 3 years ago. He walked out of our house in Greenwich at around 2 p.m. We thought he was just going back to his apartment in the city. He was subletting a place in the village for the summer, working an internship at a non-profit called Global Communities Initiative. We didn't think anything of it when he didn't call that night. He often went a few days without calling in. But then his supervisor called on June 18th, asking if he was sick because he'd missed 3 days of work without calling in. Marcus's hands were shaking now. We went to his apartment. The landlord let us in. Everything was there, his laptop, his clothes, his books, his wallet, but he was gone. And he was wearing that watch. I know he was wearing it because I noticed it when he walked out the door. I noticed it and thought, at least he still wears the watch I gave him, even if he hates everything else about me.
Sophie looked down at the watch, seeing it differently now. Not as a beautiful object she'd saved to buy, but as evidence of a moment when someone had walked out a door and never walked back through it. The police investigated, Evelyn said. They interviewed his friends, his co-workers, his professors. They pulled his bank records, his phone records. The last charge on his credit card was for a coffee at a shop near his apartment on June 15th at 4:30 p.m. The last call from his phone was to a friend named Michael Torres at 6:15 p.m. They talked for 8 minutes. Michael said Daniel sounded normal, maybe a little stressed, but normal. And then, nothing. His phone went dead. No activity on his credit cards, his bank account, his social media. No sightings, no leads. After 6 months, the detective told us that without evidence of foul play, they had to assume he left voluntarily. But he wouldn't, Marcus said fiercely. He wouldn't leave without telling his mother. He wouldn't abandon his friends, his work. He was angry at me, yes, but he adored Evelyn. He called her every week, sent her photos of street art and funny signs and books he thought she'd like. He wouldn't disappear on her, not willingly. The private dining room felt very small suddenly, filled with the weight of 3 years of unanswered questions, of a family fractured by absence, of a young man who had walked out a door and into nothing. Sophie unbuckled the watch carefully and placed it on the table between them. Lou's pawn shop. The owner's name is Lou Chen. He's been running that shop for 30 years. I went there looking for watches because I knew they'd have a good selection, and I'd heard from a friend that Lou was honest, that he didn't deal in stolen goods. The watch was in a locked display case with other expensive items. Lou said it had come in about 2 months before, that the seller had seemed legitimate, had proper ID and everything. He gave me a receipt with the description of the watch and the date I purchased it, March 14th. Marcus was taking notes on his phone now, his business mind kicking in despite his emotional state. If Lou bought it 2 months before you purchased it, that means it came into the shop around January, almost 3 years after Daniel disappeared. Where was it for those 3 years? And who brought it in? Evelyn added. Did Lou keep records of the seller? I don't know, Sophie admitted. I didn't ask. Why would I? I was just a customer buying a watch. But Lou keeps meticulous records. I remember thinking that when I bought it. He wrote everything down in a ledger, and he made copies of my ID. If the seller was legitimate like he said, he probably has their information too. Marcus stood abruptly, pulling out his phone. I'm calling our investigator, Raymond Burke. He's a private detective who worked Daniel's case after the police gave up. He'll want to talk to you, Sophie, and we need to get to that pawn shop before it closes. What time does Lou close? 9 p.m. usually, Sophie said. But Mr. Hale, it's 8:35 now. Even if we leave right now, we might not make it from Manhattan to Queens in time. Then we call him. Andrew, the manager. He'll have the restaurant directory. Someone here knows someone who knows someone. That's how this city works. But Evelyn stood and put her hand on her husband's arm. Marcus, stop. Breathe. You're spiraling. He looked at her with wild eyes. We finally have a lead, Evelyn. After 3 years of nothing, we finally have something. I know, she said gently, and we're going to follow it, but not like this, not by bulldozing through everything in a panic. Sophie has given us incredible information. She's agreed to help. We have the watch, and we know where it came from. We can go to Lou's tomorrow morning when it opens. We can bring Raymond. We can do this the right way. Marcus opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. The adrenaline was leaving his system, and in its wake was exhaustion, the bone-deep tiredness of 3 years of searching and hoping and grieving all at once. You're right, he said quietly. He turned to Sophie. I'm sorry. Again, I keep apologizing to you, and I keep making you deal with my intensity. But tomorrow, could you meet us tomorrow morning, 10 a.m. at Lou's pawn shop? We'll pay you for your time, $500 an hour. Sophie's eyes widened. That's way too much. It's not nearly enough, Evelyn said softly. You've given us something we thought we'd lost forever. You've given us hope. Sophie looked at the watch sitting on the table, at the couple sitting across from her with their grief and their sudden fragile hope, and she thought about her own family, about how she'd do anything for her little brother, about how love made people vulnerable and fierce in equal measure. "You don't have to pay me," she said. "I'll meet you at 10 a.m., and I'll do whatever I can to help you find out what happened to Daniel." Sophie Martinez lived in a third-floor walk-up in Astoria, Queens, in an apartment that had been her grandmother's before cancer had taken her 2 years ago. The walls still held her abuela's paste, paintings of tropical landscapes that bore no resemblance to New York, ceramic roosters that had somehow become a collection over decades, photographs of family members stretching back to when photography was a rare and precious thing. The apartment smelled like the jasmine incense her mother burned to cover the scent of age and cooking and too many people living in too few rooms. Sophie arrived home at 1:15 a.m., her body aching from the kind of exhaustion that came from emotional whiplash rather than physical labor. The subway ride had been endless, each stop a small eternity where she'd stared at the watch on her wrist and thought about Daniel Hale, about how he'd worn this same watch, how his fingers had touched these same metal links, how somewhere in the microscopic spaces of this object there might be traces of him still. The apartment was dark except for the blue glow of a laptop screen in the living room. Her brother Miguel was still awake, sprawled on the sagging couch with his headphones on, watching something that made his face flicker with changing light. He was 17, tall and gangly, with the kind of awkwardness that promised future handsomeness if he could just figure out what to do with his 2 long limbs. He was supposed to be asleep on school nights, but Sophie had long ago given up trying to enforce bedtimes for a kid who was practically an adult. "You're late," Miguel said, pulling off his headphones. Then he saw her face. What happened? Sophie sat down next to him, suddenly desperate for the solid reality of her brother, for the reminder that her family was here and whole and safe. "Something strange," she said. "Something really strange." She told him the story, watching his eyes grow wide as she described Marcus Hale's reaction, the missing son, the watch that had suddenly become so much more than a birthday present. When she finished, Miguel was staring at the watch on her wrist with something like fear. "So this might have belonged to a dead person?" he asked. "We don't know that he's dead," Sophie said quickly. "He's missing. That's different." "Missing for 3 years, Soph. The statistics on that aren't good." Miguel was the smart one, the one who was going to get out of Astoria and go to a good college and have a life that wasn't defined by shift work and careful budgeting and dreams deferred. He read constantly, consumed information like other kids consumed social media, and had the kind of precise memory that made him infuriating to argue with because he was always right about facts. "I know," Sophie said quietly, "but his parents don't know, and they deserve to find out. That's why I'm meeting them tomorrow morning." "You're missing your Friday shift." "I'll make it up. I'll take someone's weekend shift." Miguel looked at her with the particular expression he wore when he wanted to say something protective but knew she'd dismiss it. "You work too hard," he said finally. "You're always working." "Someone has to," Sophie said, but without heat. This was an old argument, worn smooth by repetition. Their father had disappeared when Miguel was 3 and Sophie was 9, not missing the way Daniel Hale was missing, but gone in the deliberate way of men who decided fatherhood was too hard and somewhere else was easier. Their mother Rosa worked as a nurse at Mount Sinai, pulling rotating shifts that meant she was often sleeping when they were awake and awake when they were sleeping, like they were living in different time zones within the same apartment.
Rosa made decent money, enough to keep them housed and fed, enough to ensure Miguel could focus on school without needing a part-time job. But decent didn't stretch to cover college tuition at the schools Miguel was dreaming about. Didn't cover the textbooks and SAT prep courses and application fees that added up faster than Sophie had imagined possible. So Sophie worked. had been working since she was 16, first at a grocery store, then at a diner, now at Le Ciel Doré, where the tips were good enough to make the condescension of wealthy diners feel almost worth it. "I'm getting you into college," Sophie continued. "That's the plan. That's always been the plan. I could take a gap year, work, save money. You wouldn't have to." "No." Sophie's voice was firm. "You're going to school on time. You're going to have the life you deserve. That's not negotiable." Miguel looked like he wanted to argue more, but he just sighed and leaned his head against her shoulder, the way he used to when he was small and scared of thunderstorms. "Tell me more about Daniel Hale," he said instead. "What did he look like?" Sophie pulled up the photo Marcus had shown her, the one she'd asked him to send to her phone before she'd left the restaurant. Daniel Hale, at 21, smiling at the camera with the kind of confidence that suggested he believed the world was fundamentally good, and he was going to help make it better. There was something gentle in his eyes, something that reminded Sophie of Miguel's particular brand of idealistic intelligence. He was studying economics, she said, wanted to do sustainable development work. His mom said he argued with his dad about corporate responsibility. "Sounds like someone I'd like," Miguel murmured. Then, "Do you think he's alive?" It was the question Sophie had been avoiding asking herself during the entire subway ride home. She looked at the watch, at its perfect craftsmanship, at the scratch on the bezel that told a story of a dropped moment, a small mistake, a piece of humanness embedded in an expensive object. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I think his parents need to find out. I think they need to know what happened, even if the answer is terrible, because not knowing, that might be worse." They sat together in the blue-lit darkness, Sophie too tired to move, and Miguel too thoughtful to break the silence. Outside, Astoria hummed with its particular nighttime soundtrack. Sirens in the distance, the bass from someone's car stereo, the rattle of the N train passing on elevated tracks 2 blocks away. This was the city's working-class symphony, so different from the hushed elegance of Le Ciel Doré, so different from the world of people who could afford to pay $500 an hour for someone's time. "Are you scared?" Miguel asked finally. She considered the question. "Maybe. It's big, you know? Like I picked up someone's tragedy and now I'm part of it. Like I have a responsibility I didn't ask for." "You could give them the watch and walk away. You don't owe them anything." "I know, but..." She struggled to articulate what she felt. "When Mr. Hale grabbed my wrist, when he saw the watch, the look on his face, Miguel, it was like watching someone see a ghost. Like the worst and best thing happened to him at the same time. And his wife, Mrs. Hale, she started crying, but she was trying not to, trying to stay strong for him. And I just kept thinking about how if you disappeared, how Mom and I would feel, how we'd grab onto any piece of hope we could find." Miguel was quiet for a long moment. "You're a good person, Soph." "I'm a tired person," she corrected, but she smiled as she said it. She finally stood, her muscles protesting the movement. "Get to bed. You have school in..." She checked her phone. 5.5 hours. "You have to be in Queens in 8.5 hours, Miguel pointed out. "I'm aware. Go." After Miguel had shuffled to the bedroom he shared with Sophie, they divided it with a bookshelf years ago, giving each of them the illusion of privacy. Sophie stood in the tiny kitchen and made herself a cup of tea she was too tired to drink. Through the thin walls, she could hear the Rodriguez family next door, the baby crying, the mother singing softly in Spanish. The Rodriguezes had 4 kids in a 2-bedroom apartment, and sometimes Sophie marveled at how they made it work, how love could expand to fill whatever space it was given. She thought about Daniel Hale's last day, about how he'd walked out of his parents' house after an argument, about how neither he nor they could have known it was the last time. Life was like that, full of last times that you didn't recognize until they'd already passed. The last time her father had picked her up before he left, the last time her grandmother had made her famous arroz con pollo, the last time Daniel Hale had worn this watch as just a watch and not as evidence of his absence. Sophie's phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "This is Evelyn Hale. I wanted to thank you again for your help. I also wanted to make sure you have our number in case anything comes up. We'll see you tomorrow at Lou's. Get some rest." Sophie saved the number and typed back, "See you tomorrow. I hope we find answers." She didn't say good answers, because she'd learned young that hope had to be tempered with realism, that wanting something didn't make it true. But she could hope for answers. That seemed safe enough. Sleep came fitfully, full of dreams about watches and missing people and the weight of other people's grief. Sophie woke at 7 a.m. to her alarm, groggy and disoriented, and for a moment she thought the entire previous evening had been a strange dream. But then she saw the watch on her nightstand, where she had carefully placed it before bed, and she knew it was all terribly, impossibly real. The morning routine was automatic. Shower, dress in jeans and her good jacket because she was meeting billionaires even if it was at a pawn shop, check that Miguel had actually gotten up for school, leave a note for her mother who would be home around 8 and sleeping until 2. The note said, "Something came up. I'll explain later. There's leftover chicken in the fridge. Love you." The N train to Roosevelt Avenue was crowded with the mid-morning mix of people. Mothers with strollers, elderly men reading newspapers in languages Sophie couldn't identify, teenagers cutting school and trying to look older than they were. Sophie held on to the pole and watched the city pass by, the underground darkness punctuated by sudden bright stations, each one a small world of its own. She thought about her own routine, about how most days she woke at 6 a.m., made breakfast for Miguel, studied community college coursework for an hour before he woke. She was taking business classes online, slowly, so slowly, chipping away at a degree that she hoped would eventually lead to restaurant management, maybe her own place someday. Got Miguel off to school, went to Le Ciel Doré for the lunch shift, came home for a few hours, went back for the dinner shift, came home exhausted, checked that Miguel had done his homework, collapsed into bed. Repeat. Every day the same. Every day a careful balance of responsibilities that left no room for things like this, for mysteries and missing people and the weight of other people's grief. But she was here anyway, because some responsibilities you didn't choose but accepted anyway, because they were right, because they were human. Lou's pawn shop sat between a laundromat and a bodega on Roosevelt Avenue, its window display a chaotic mix of guitars, jewelry, electronics, and sports equipment. The shop had been there for as long as Sophie can remember, a permanent fixture in a neighborhood where most businesses turned over every few years. Lou Chan himself was in his 60s, a stocky man with gray hair and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He was known in the neighborhood as fair. He didn't lowball people who were desperate, didn't deal in stolen goods, and kept a small fund he used to help regulars who were short on their payments get their items back. Sophie arrived at 9:55 a.m., 5 minutes early because her grandmother had taught her that early was on time and on time was late. The shop was already open, Lou behind the counter organizing a display of watches, the irony wasn't lost on Sophie, while a customer browsed the guitar section.
And a simple sweater. They were trying to look normal, Sophie realized, trying not to stand out in a neighborhood where their wealth would otherwise make them targets or spectacles, or both. With them was a third person, a man in his 50s with the weathered face of someone who'd spent decades looking at the worst of what people could do to each other. He had a detective's eyes, watchful, assessing, missing nothing. "Sophie," Evelyn said warmly, as if they were old friends meeting for coffee rather than near strangers united by tragedy. "Thank you for coming. This is Raymond Burke. He's the private investigator who worked Daniel's case." Raymond shook Sophie's hand with a firm grip. "Ms. Martinez, the Hales have told me about last night. I have to say, in 3 years of dead ends, this is the first real lead we've had. I've already pulled the police file this morning, cross-referenced it with the pawn shop databases. If Lu Chin has records of who sold him this watch, we might finally have a trail to follow." They entered the shop together, the bell above the door chiming with false cheerfulness. Lu looked up from his watch display, and his expression shifted from shopkeeper-friendly to wary when he saw the group. He was a man who developed instincts about trouble, and 4 people walking into his shop with determined faces registered immediately as complicated. "Sophie," he said, his accent carrying traces of Cantonese despite 40 years in New York, "what brings you back? Problem with the watch?" "Not exactly," Sophie said. "Lu, this is going to sound strange, but the watch I bought from you in March, I need to know where it came from." Lu's wariness deepened. "Why? Is there a problem?" Marcus stepped forward, and Sophie could see him forcibly gentling his approach, trying not to be the man who terrorized her in the restaurant. "Mr. Chen, my name is Marcus Hale. That watch belonged to my son, who's been missing for 3 years. We're not accusing you of anything. We know you run an honest business, but any information you have about who brought that watch in could help us find out what happened to him." Lu's face softened immediately. He was a father too. Sophie remembered seeing photos of his grown children behind the counter, remembered him mentioning his daughter who was a doctor, his son who taught high school. He understood what it meant to lose a child, even temporarily. "Missing 3 years," Lu repeated quietly. He looked at Sophie. "You didn't know?" "How could I?" Sophie said. "It was just a watch in your case, a beautiful watch I saved to buy." Lu nodded slowly, then moved to a filing cabinet behind the counter. "I keep records of everything: name, ID, description of item, date of purchase, price paid. Insurance for me, proof of legitimate transaction. Give me a moment." He pulled out a ledger, actual paper, not digital, which made Raymond Burke's eyes light up because paper couldn't be deleted, couldn't be scrubbed from a hard drive. Lu flipped through pages, his finger tracing down entries until he stopped. "Here," he said. "Patek Philippe Nautilus, blue face, distinctive scratch on bezel. Brought in January 7th of this year by a—" he squinted at the handwriting, "Marcus Lee, Korean-American male, mid-20s. Driver's license from New York State. I made a copy." He pulled out a photocopied driver's license and placed it on the counter. The man in the photo was young, Asian, with the kind of bland pleasantness that came from knowing how to smile for official photos without revealing anything real. The name read Marcus Lee, with an address in Flushing. "This is the person who sold you the watch?" Raymond asked, already pulling out his phone to photograph the license.
Yes, he came in with several items, the watch, a laptop, some jewelry. Said he was moving abroad, needed to liquidate assets quickly. He seemed nervous, but not in a stolen goods way. More like he was in a hurry, had somewhere to be. I gave him $9,000 for everything. The watch alone was worth at least $30,000 if it was authentic, which I verified with the dealer I trust. $9,000 for a $30,000 watch? Evelyn asked, her voice tight. Lu shrugged. Pawn shop prices. He needed cash fast, and I needed to make a profit. That's how it works. But I was fair. Some shops would have given him half that. Marcus was staring at the photocopied license with an intensity that made Sophie think of a predator spotting prey. Marcus Lee. Do you remember anything else about him? Anything he said? Any distinguishing features? Lu thought for a moment. He had a tattoo on his left forearm, Chinese characters. I remember because I'm Cantonese and I noticed they were traditional characters, not simplified. They said something like endure or persevere, and he drove up in a blue Honda Civic, maybe 2010 or so. I noticed because he parked right in front and I could see him checking the mirrors a lot, like he was worried about someone following him. Raymond was taking notes rapidly. Did he come back? Try to sell anything else? No, that was the only time I saw him. Security cameras? Raymond asked hopefully. Lou shook his head. They broke 2 years ago. I haven't had the money to fix them. I know. In this neighborhood I should, but business has been slow. Marcus pulled out his wallet and placed $500 bills on the counter. For your time and information, and for new cameras. Lou looked at the money, then at Marcus, and something passed between them. One father to another. One man who'd lost something, to another who'd lost everything. Find your son, Lou said, pushing the money back. The information is free, but the cameras? Yeah, I'll take that. Thank you. They left the shop with more than they had arrived with. A name, an address, a description, a date. January 7th. 6 months ago. The watch had surfaced almost 3 years after Daniel disappeared, brought in by someone who was nervous, in a hurry, liquidating assets, someone who drove a blue Honda Civic and had a tattoo about endurance. On the sidewalk outside, Raymond was already on his phone, running searches. Marcus Lee, Flushing address. There are probably 1,000 Marcus Lees in New York, but the driver's license narrows it down. I can run this through databases, cross-reference with known associates of Daniel's, check if this name has come up anywhere in the investigation. How long will that take? Give me a few hours. Maybe less if I call in some favors with NYPD. We don't have a few hours, Marcus said, his voice rising with the particular frustration of a man accustomed to solving problems immediately through force of will and money. We have an address. We can go there now. Marcus? Evelyn said gently. We can't just show up at someone's door and accuse them of... What? We don't even know what we're accusing them of. He had Daniel's watch, Marcus said. A watch Daniel would never have sold. A watch that disappeared with my son. That's not a coincidence. Raymond stepped between them, physically and metaphorically. Mr. Hale, I understand your urgency, but we need to be smart about this. If Marcus Lee is involved in Daniel's disappearance, showing up at his door could spook him into running. Or worse, if there's any chance Daniel is alive somewhere, tipping off whoever has him could put him in danger. We need to surveil first, gather information, understand what we're dealing with. Raymond's right, Evelyn said, though she could see it cost her something to counsel patience. We've waited 3 years. We can wait a few more hours to do this right. Marcus looked like he wanted to argue, but instead he just closed his eyes and took a long breath. When he opened them, he looked at Sophie. What do you think? The question surprised him. Why would her opinion matter? But then he realized she was the one who'd found the watch, the one who'd brought them this far. She'd become part of this story whether she'd intended or not.
I think, Sophie said carefully, that you should listen to the professional. But I also think maybe we could drive by? Not stop, not approach, just see the place. See if Marcus Lee's car is there. Get a sense of the neighborhood. That doesn't seem risky. Raymond considered this. Drive-by reconnaissance. That's actually not a bad idea. See if the address is valid, if anyone's home, what the situation looks like. As long as you promise not to engage. We promise, Evelyn said quickly, before Marcus could respond. Then let's go, Raymond said. My car or yours? They ended up in Raymond's car, a nondescript gray sedan that looked like every other car on the road, which was the point. Sophie found herself in the back seat between Marcus and Evelyn, feeling like she'd been absorbed into their family emergency, like her life had been temporarily hijacked by their urgency and grief. The drive from Roosevelt Avenue to Flushing took 20 minutes through midday traffic. Raymond drove carefully, professionally, while Marcus pulled up everything he could on his phone about Marcus Lee, Flushing address, age, mid-20s. "There's a Marcus Lee who works at a cell phone store in Flushing," Marcus said, scrolling through search results. "Age 26, studied business at Queens College. LinkedIn profile says he's been at Metro Mobile for 3 years. No criminal record that I can find through public databases. Could be our guy, or could be one of the other Marcus Lees. Won't know until we see him." The address led them to a modest apartment building on a tree-lined street. 3 stories, brick facade, the kind of place that had been built in the 1960s and had aged into comfortable anonymity. There was a small parking lot behind the building, accessible from an alley, and Raymond cruised past slowly, all of them craning their necks to look. "Blue Honda Civic," Sophie said suddenly, pointing. "Third spot from the left." It was there, a 2009 Civic with a dent in the rear bumper and a parking permit for the building hanging from the rearview mirror. Just a car in a parking lot, but to the people in Raymond's sedan, it was evidence, confirmation, a thread leading somewhere they desperately needed to go. Raymond circled the block and parked across the street with a sight line to both the building's entrance and the parking lot. "Now we wait, see if anyone comes or goes. Sophie, you said Lou mentioned a tattoo on the left forearm. Chinese characters?" "Yes, he said they meant something like endure or persevere." They sat in silence, all of them watching the building with the intensity of people who'd forgotten how to be casual, how to pretend this was anything other than the most important surveillance of their lives. Sophie thought about calling in sick to her evening shift at Le Ciel Doré, thought about Miguel getting home from school to an empty apartment, thought about how her carefully ordered life had been upended by a watch she'd bought innocently, lovingly, not knowing it carried someone else's tragedy in its metal links. "Tell me about Daniel's friends," Sophie said, because the silence was becoming oppressive and she needed to fill it with something. "Did the police investigate them?" Evelyn stirred, grateful for something to focus on besides the unmoving building. "Yes, extensively. His closest friend was Michael Torres. They've been roommates freshman year at Columbia. Michael was devastated when Daniel disappeared. He helped us search, made flyers, posted on social media constantly. He still sends me messages on Daniel's birthday. There was Emily Chen, his girlfriend. They'd been together for 2 years. She was studying environmental science, planning to work in conservation. She and Daniel used to talk about starting a nonprofit together, something that would connect environmental protection with economic development in indigenous communities. After he disappeared, Emily fell apart. She dropped out of school for a semester, went into therapy. She eventually transferred to Berkeley, needed to get away from all the reminders.
"Did the police suspect her?" Sophie asked. Raymond shook his head. "No, she had an alibi for the day Daniel disappeared. She was at a family wedding in California. Dozens of witnesses. And honestly, everything about her screamed genuine grief. I interviewed her myself. She was destroyed by losing him." "What about enemies?" Sophie pressed. "Someone who might have wanted to hurt him?" "Daniel didn't have enemies," Evelyn said firmly. "He had debates, disagreements, people who thought he was too idealistic or naive. But enemies? People who would kidnap him or hurt him? No. He was kind, Sophie. He volunteered at a food bank. He tutored kids in the Bronx. He argued with his father about business ethics, yes, but he also helped elderly neighbors with their groceries and learned everyone's name. The doorman, the barista, the homeless man who sat outside his apartment building. Daniel made people's lives better by being in them." The weight of who Daniel had been. Not just a missing person, but a good person. Someone who'd tried to make the world gentler. Settled over the car like snow. Quiet and heavy. "There was one thing," Marcus said reluctantly. "Something Daniel was looking into before he disappeared. He'd become interested in this company, Meridian Development Group. They were planning a resort project in Ecuador that would have displaced an indigenous community. Daniel had gotten in touch with activists there, was trying to coordinate opposition to the project. He'd written several articles for the Columbia student newspaper about it, had even started a petition. And? Raymond prompted, because clearly there was more. And Meridian Development Group is a subsidiary of Hale Industries, my company. I didn't know about the Ecuador project specifically. We have dozens of projects running simultaneously, and I trust my regional directors to handle the details. But when Daniel confronted me about it at that last meeting, when he accused me of destroying indigenous communities for profit, he wasn't wrong. The project was exactly what he said it was, and I defended it. I told him that economic development sometimes required difficult choices, that the community would be compensated, that progress always had costs. That's what you argued about? Sophie asked. That last conversation? Yes. He said I'd become exactly the kind of businessman he'd sworn never to be. He said I cared more about profit margins than people's lives. He said... Marcus's voice cracked slightly. He said he was ashamed to be my son. Evelyn's hand found her husband's, their fingers interlacing with the unconscious ease of decades together. You didn't tell me that part, she said softly. I couldn't. It hurt too much. And then he disappeared, and I kept thinking, what if that's the last thing he believed about me, that I was someone to be ashamed of? They sat with that pain, with the particular agony of unfinished conversations and words that couldn't be taken back. Sophie thought about her last conversation with her father before he'd left, about how she'd told him she hated him for missing her school play. She was 9. She hadn't really meant it, but those were the last words she'd ever said to him, and they'd hung in her memory like hooks for years. Did the police investigate Meridian Development Group? If Daniel was causing problems for a major project? They looked into it. I looked into it. There was no evidence that anyone at Meridian even knew who Daniel was beyond his articles in the student newspaper. The project manager in Ecuador said they'd received some emails from student activists, but hadn't considered them a serious threat. The timeline didn't add up either. The Ecuador project was put on hold 6 months before Daniel disappeared, not because of his advocacy, but because of permitting issues with the Ecuadorian government. So, a dead end. Most leads in missing person cases are dead ends. You follow hundreds of threads, and 99 of them go nowhere. But you follow them anyway, because the 100th one might be the answer. Movement caught Sophie's eye. The building's front door was opening, and a young man emerged, carrying a messenger bag, and walking with the casual purpose of someone heading to work. He was Asian, mid-20s, average height, wearing a Metro Mobile polo shirt. He was too far away to see details clearly, but as he walked towards the parking lot, turning slightly to check for traffic, Sophie caught a glimpse of his left forearm. There, she said urgently, the tattoo. He has a tattoo on his left arm. Raymond was already raising a camera with a long lens, snapping photos as the young man, Marcus Lee, presumably, walked to the blue Honda Civic, unlocked it, and drove out.
Away. The whole sequence took maybe 90 seconds, but it felt stretched out, significant, like watching a key turn in a lock that had been sealed for years. That's him, Raymond confirmed, reviewing the photos on his camera screen. License plate matches the registration for Marcus Lee at this address. And look, he zoomed in on one photo, the tattoo. Chinese characters, just like Lou said. They all leaned in to look at the screen. The tattoo was visible in the photo, though not perfectly clear. But it was there, dark ink on skin, permanent testimony to something Marcus Lee thought was important enough to carry on his body. Now what? Marcus asked. Now I follow him, Raymond said, already starting the engine. See where he goes, who he talks to, what his routine is. You 3, you go home, or go somewhere, but you can't be part of this surveillance. If he notices the car, I can explain it away as traffic. If he sees all of you staring at him, we lose the advantage. I'm not leaving, Marcus said flatly. Yes, you are, Evelyn said, her voice allowing no argument. Raymond knows what he's doing. We're going to let him do his job. Right, Marcus?
It was the voice of a woman who'd spent decades managing her husband's intensity, who'd learned when to give him space and when to rein him in. Marcus looked like he wanted to argue, but he just nodded tightly. They switched cars at the next block, Raymond dropping them off and continuing to tail Marcus Lee's Civic, while Marcus, Evelyn, and Sophie stood on the sidewalk in Flushing, suddenly purposeless. "I should get to work," Sophie said, checking her phone. It was 11:30 a.m. She was supposed to start her shift at noon. If she took the subway now, she'd only be a little late. "Let us drive you. It's the least we can do. And, Sophie, I know this has disrupted your life. We want to compensate you for your time, for missing work." Sophie opened her mouth to refuse, but Evelyn held up a hand. "Please, let us do this. You've helped us more than you know." The drive back to Manhattan in the Hale's car felt surreal. Sophie in leather seats that probably cost more than her monthly rent, watching the city slide past through tinted windows, listening to Marcus make calls to lawyers and investigators, mobilizing resources with the casual power of someone who'd spent his life making things happen through sheer force of will. "If Marcus Lee is involved in Daniel's disappearance, I want to know everything about him. Employment history, financial records, known associates, criminal background, parking tickets, library cards, everything. Yes, I know some of that requires warrants, so get warrants. I don't care what it costs." Evelyn caught Sophie's eye in the rearview mirror and offered a small, apologetic smile. This was her normal, this intensity, this deployment of resources, the assumption that every problem could be solved if you just applied enough money and determination to it. They dropped Sophie off in front of Lucille Doré at 12:15 p.m. Before she got out, Evelyn handed her an envelope. "For your time this morning. And, Sophie, thank you. For caring. For helping. For being someone who chose to be kind when you didn't have to be." Sophie opened the envelope after the car had pulled away and found 20 $100 bills. $2,000 for 4 hours, more than she made in a month at the restaurant. She stood on the sidewalk, holding the money and feeling the weight of it, the way it represented not just payment but obligation, connection, the way she'd been woven into a story that wasn't hers, but had somehow become partly hers anyway. Andrew Chen met her at the staff entrance, his face a mix of concern and curiosity. "Sophie, are you okay? What happened last night? I've never seen anything like that." "I'm fine," which was only partly true. "It was just complicated. Is my shift still okay?" "Of course, but take a minute if you need to. Maria's covering your section until you're ready."
Sophie went to the staff bathroom and splashed cold water on her face, staring at herself in the mirror. She looked tired, slightly dazed, like someone who'd stumbled into a story bigger than she'd anticipated. The watch sat on her wrist, and she wondered if she should take it off, give it back to Marcus and Evelyn, return this piece of evidence to its rightful owners. But something made her keep it on. Maybe because it was evidence and shouldn't be disturbed. Maybe because it connected her to Daniel Hale in some strange way, made her feel responsible for seeing this through. Or maybe just because it was beautiful, and she'd saved to buy it, and giving it up felt like surrendering a piece of herself. She worked her shift in a daze, going through the motions of serving wealthy diners who had no idea that their waitress was carrying someone's tragedy on her wrist, that she'd spent her morning staking out an apartment building in Queens, that she had $2,000 in her locker that represented more money than she'd ever held at once. The routine of work was almost comforting, the familiar dance of taking orders, delivering food, clearing plates, smiling professionally at people who sometimes remembered to say thank you and sometimes didn't. During her break, Sophie called Miguel. "Hey," she said when he answered. "How was school?" "Fine. Boring. The usual." "How was your mysterious morning meeting?" Sophie gave him the abbreviated version, the pawn shop, the name Marcus Lee, the apartment building, the surveillance. She could hear Miguel's breathing change, the way it did when he was processing information and trying to fit puzzle pieces together. So this Marcus Lee guy had the watch, which means either he knew Daniel Hale, or he knew whoever took Daniel Hale, or he found the watch somehow. Those are basically the three options. Yeah, the detective is following him now, trying to figure out which one.
And you're just, what, going back to normal life while this plays out? What else can I do? I gave them all the information I have. The rest is up to them. But even if she said it, Sophie knew it wasn't true. She wasn't done with this story. It had its hooks in her now, and she wouldn't be able to let go until she knew how it ended. "Be careful," Miguel said, which was his way of saying he loved her. "Don't get too deep into other people's drama." "I won't," Sophie promised, which was a lie, but a loving one. She worked until 8 p.m., then took the subway home through the evening rush, pressed between commuters who all looked as tired as she felt. When she got to the apartment, Miguel was at the kitchen table with his homework spread out around him, and their mother was awake for once, making dinner, arroz con pollo, their grandmother's recipe, the one that made the whole apartment smell like home. "Mija," Rosa said, turning from the stove to study her daughter's face, "you look exhausted. Bad shift?" "Long day," which was true enough. She hugged her mother, breathing in the scent of garlic and sofrito and the particular perfume Rosa wore that had been her signature for as long as Sophie could remember. "I'm okay, though." They ate dinner together, all three of them at the small table, and for a little while Sophie could almost forget about missing billionaire sons and mysterious men named Marcus Hale and watches that carried the weight of unanswered questions. For a little while she was just Sophie Martinez, 23 years old, eating her mother's cooking and listening to Miguel complain about his chemistry teacher, and feeling the solid realness of her own family, her own life, her own story. But later, after her mother had gone back to bed for her night shift and Miguel was asleep behind his bookshelf divider, Sophie sat on the couch in the dark and Googled Daniel Hale. She found his student newspaper articles about the Ecuador project, found his social media profiles that had been frozen in time for 3 years, found photos of him smiling at birthday parties and graduation ceremonies and what looked like a protest march for climate justice. She found an article from the Columbia Daily Spectator about his disappearance, with a photo of Marcus and Evelyn at a press conference, their faces drawn with the particular exhaustion of new grief. She found a blog post from Emily Chen, his ex-girlfriend, written 6 months after he vanished. "I keep expecting to see you, on the subway, in coffee shops, walking past my building. I keep expecting this to be a mistake, or a bad dream, or some elaborate plan you concocted for reasons I don't understand. But you wouldn't do that."
Wouldn't hurt people like this on purpose, which means someone hurt you, and I don't know how to live with that knowledge. Sophie read until her eyes burned, until she'd consumed every piece of Daniel Hale she could find online, until she felt like she knew him, not personally, but in the way you can know someone through the outline of their life, through the testimony of people who loved them. Daniel Hale had been real, had been kind, had believed the world could be better if people just tried harder to care about each other. And then he'd walked out a door and vanished. And 3 years later, a stranger named Sophie Martinez was wearing his watch and wondering what had happened, wondering if there were answers to be found or just more questions, deeper mysteries, tragedy without resolution. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "This is Raymond Burke. Followed Marcus Hale to his workplace and then to a gym. Nothing suspicious. But I got a photo of the tattoo, clear this time, attaching it. If you can think of anything else that might help, any detail about the watch or the pawn shop, please let me know." The attached photo showed Marcus Hale's left forearm clearly. The tattoo was 2 Chinese characters in traditional script, bold and black against his skin. Sophie stared at them, wishing she could read Chinese, wishing the characters would somehow reveal their meaning through sheer force of her wanting to understand. She screenshot the image and sent it to her friend Wei, who was second-generation Chinese-American and read both traditional and simplified characters. "Can you translate this? It's important." Wei responded 5 minutes later. "Rin Nai." It means endure, or persevere, or patience through suffering.
It's the kind of tattoo people get when they've been through something hard and want to remember they survived it. Why? Long story, she typed back. Thanks. Endure. Persevere. Patience through suffering. What had Marcus Lee endured? What did he survive that required a permanent reminder inked into his skin? Sophie fell asleep on the couch with her phone in her hand, and she dreamed of watches ticking backward, of doors that opened to nothing, of a young man walking away from his parents' house and disappearing into white fog that swallowed him whole. She dreamed of Chinese characters that rearranged themselves into accusations, into confessions, into answers that dissolved the moment she tried to read them. When she woke at 6 a.m. to her alarm, she had 7 missed calls from Evelyn Hale and 1 voicemail that made her sit up so fast she nearly fell off the couch. Sophie, it's Evelyn. Raymond just called. Marcus Lee didn't go home last night. He drove to the Bronx instead, to a storage facility. Raymond followed him inside. There are hundreds of units, and Marcus Lee went to one on the 3rd floor. Raymond couldn't get close enough to see what was inside, but... Her voice cracked slightly. Marcus Lee was there for 3 hours. 3 hours in a storage unit in the middle of the night. Raymond's still there, watching, waiting for him to leave. We don't know what it means, but we wanted you to know. Call me when you can. Sophie called back immediately, her heart pounding. Evelyn answered on the first ring. What's happening? We don't know yet, Evelyn said, and Sophie could hear the barely controlled panic in her voice. Marcus, my husband, wanted to go to the Bronx immediately, wanted to break into the storage unit, wanted to call the police. Raymond convinced him to wait, to let this play out. But if Daniel is in there, if he's been in there this whole time... She couldn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to, because they were both thinking the same thing. 3 years in a storage unit? Nobody survived 3 years in a storage unit. I'm coming, Sophie said, already moving toward her bedroom to find clothes. Where are you? Sophie, you don't have to... Where are you?
Evelyn gave her the address, a storage facility in the South Bronx, by the water, in an industrial area that was slowly being converted into expensive lofts, but wasn't there yet. Sophie wrote it down, woke Miguel with urgent whispered instructions about getting himself to school, left another note for her mother, and was out the door in 15 minutes. The subway ride felt endless. Sophie stood pressed against the door, watching the darkness of the tunnel punctuated by station lights, and she thought about Daniel Hale, about whether they were about to find him or just find more pieces of him, more clues that led nowhere, more questions that had no good answers. She thought about Marcus Lee's tattoo. Endure. Persevere. What had he endured? And more importantly, had Daniel Hale endured it too? The Bronx storage facility sat like a concrete fortress between a defunct industrial laundry and a building that advertised artist lofts starting at $2,400 a month. A price that would have been laughable as expensive 5 years ago and was now considered a bargain in a city that devoured affordability like a hungry beast. The storage facility was 5 stories tall, windowless except for the ground floor office, painted a dingy beige that had probably been meant to look neutral but just looked defeated. Evelyn arrived at 7:45 a.m. to find Raymond Burke's gray sedan parked across the street, and inside it, Marcus and Evelyn Hale looked like they'd aged a decade overnight. Marcus's normally impeccable appearance had dissolved into wrinkled clothes and uncombed hair, and Evelyn's eyes were red-rimmed behind her sunglasses. Neither of them had slept. How could they? Their son might be 100 yards away, locked in a storage unit, and they were sitting in a car doing nothing because the professional investigator had told them to wait. Sophie slid into the back seat without knocking, and Evelyn turned to look at her with something like relief. "You came," Evelyn said simply. "Of course I came. What's happened since you called?" Raymond answered, his voice rough with exhaustion.
Marcus Lee left the storage facility at 4:15 a.m., drove back to his apartment in Flushing. He's there now, presumably sleeping. I called in a favor with NYPD, Detective Maria Santos, someone I trust. She's working on getting a warrant to search the storage unit. But these things take time, and we don't have probable cause beyond suspicious behavior, which isn't enough for a judge to sign off on breaking into someone's private storage unit. So we wait, Marcus said bitterly. While my son might be... He couldn't finish the sentence. We're not just waiting, Raymond said firmly. I've got a colleague watching Marcus Lee's apartment. If he moves, we'll know. And I've been making calls. Marcus Lee works at Metro Mobile in Flushing. I'm trying to find coworkers who might know him, might give us insight into who he is, what he's involved in. I'm also running enhanced background checks, looking for connections to Daniel, to Ecuador, to anything that might explain why he'd have Daniel's watch. But nothing yet, Marcus said. Nothing yet, Raymond confirmed. They sat in silence, watching the storage facility like it might spontaneously reveal its secrets if they just stared hard enough. The morning sun was climbing higher and higher, casting long shadows across the industrial landscape. And the city was waking up around them. Delivery trucks rumbling past, workers arriving at nearby warehouses, the ambient noise of a neighborhood transitioning from night shift to day shift. Sophie's phone buzzed. Miguel, texting, "Mom got your note. She's worried, said you need to stop getting involved in dangerous situations. I told her you're fine, but she made me promise to check on you. So, you fine?" Sophie typed back, "I'm fine. With the Hales. We'll explain everything later. Don't worry." Miguel's response was immediate. "Too late. Already worried. Be careful." "There's another option," Sophie said suddenly. "We could go to the storage facility office and ask to see the rental records for Marcus Lee's unit. Maybe whoever works there would tell us what he's storing, or at least how long he's had the unit." Raymond shook his head. "Can't do that without tipping our hand. Storage facilities are required to protect customer privacy. The moment we ask questions, word could get back to Marcus Lee, and then we lose any advantage we have. So we sit here and do nothing."
We sit here and wait for the right moment to do something, Raymond corrected. There's a difference. But Sophie could feel Marcus's frustration radiating through the car like heat, could see the way his hands kept clenching and unclenching, the way he looked at the storage facility like he might simply will it to open through sheer determination. Then Raymond's phone rang. He answered, listened intently, and his expression shifted from exhaustion to sharp alertness. "You're sure?" "Okay, we're on our way." He hung up and turned to Marcus and Evelyn. "Detective Santos got the warrant. We can search the unit. Now." The next 20 minutes blurred together, police cars arriving quietly, no sirens. Detective Santos greeting them with the grim professionalism of someone who'd seen too many cases like this end badly. She was in her 40s, with short dark hair and eyes that had witnessed the worst of humanity, but somehow remained compassionate. "Mr. and Mrs. Hale, I need to prepare you. Whatever we find in that unit, it's been there for possibly 3 years. You should wait here while we—" "No," Marcus said. "I'm going in." "Marcus," Evelyn's voice was steady but firm, "let them do their job first. If Daniel is there," her voice caught, "we'll know soon enough." They watched from the parking lot as Detective Santos and 2 officers entered the facility with the property manager, a nervous man in his 50s who kept saying he ran a legitimate business, that he couldn't possibly monitor what every tenant stored. Raymond stayed with the Hales, one hand on Marcus's shoulder as if physically preventing him from following. 15 minutes that felt like hours. Then Detective Santos emerged and her expression told them everything before she said a word. "There's nobody," she said immediately, and Evelyn's knees buckled with relief. Marcus caught her, both of them holding each other up. "But there are items that may be connected to your son. Personal effects, documents. Mr. Burke, I'd like you to come identify what you can." Raymond went inside. Sophie stayed with Marcus and Evelyn, the 3 of them standing in the morning sun like survivors of a shipwreck, clinging to the fragile hope that no body meant still alive. When Raymond returned, he was carrying an evidence bag containing a laptop. "It's Daniel's. His serial number matches. And there are boxes, clothes, books, his Columbia ID, his passport. It's like someone packed up his entire life and stored it here. But why? Why would Marcus Lee have Daniel's things? That's what we need to find out. We're bringing Marcus Lee in for questioning. Mr. and Mrs. Hale, I need you to understand. Having someone's possessions doesn't necessarily mean he harmed your son. There could be explanations, but we'll get answers. They arrested Marcus Lee at his apartment 4 hours later. Sophie watched the news coverage from Le Ciel Doré during her break, the young man being let out in handcuffs, his face shocked and scared, looking nothing like a villain and everything like someone who'd made terrible choices he couldn't undo. The interrogation lasted 6 hours. Sophie learned what happened through a call from Evelyn that evening, her voice shaking with emotions Sophie couldn't name. Not quite relief, not quite grief, something suspended between both. Marcus Lee had known Daniel Hale. They'd met through Global Communities Initiative, the nonprofit where Daniel had interned. Marcus Lee had been a volunteer, helping with their technology infrastructure. They'd become friends, not close friends, but friendly enough to get coffee occasionally to talk about their shared interest in using technology for social good.
On June 15th, 3 years ago, Daniel had called Marcus Lee in a panic. He'd discovered something. Evidence that someone at Meridian Development Group had been bribing Ecuadorian officials to push through the resort project, falsifying environmental impact reports, threatening indigenous leaders who opposed the development. Daniel had compiled documents, had proof, was planning to go public with it. But Daniel was also terrified. He'd received threatening messages, noticed strange cars following him, felt watched. He asked Marcus Lee to hold on to his laptop and some documents. Insurance, he'd called it. Evidence that would be safe even if something happened to him. And then Daniel had disappeared. Not taken by corporate conspirators or shadowy villains, simply gone. According to Marcus Lee, Daniel had called him on June 16th, a call that didn't show in any phone records because Daniel had used a burner phone. Daniel said he needed to disappear for a while, that he'd uncovered something bigger and more dangerous than he'd imagined, that the threats were real. He asked Marcus Lee to keep his things safe, to not tell anyone, to wait for him to reach out. But Daniel never reached out again. Marcus Lee had panicked. He'd kept Daniel's things, not knowing what else to do. He'd monitored the news coverage of the disappearance, had watched the Hales suffer, but had been too scared to come forward. And the watch, Daniel had given it to him for safekeeping too, along with everything else. When Marcus Lee lost his job and needed money quickly, facing eviction and mounting debts, he'd sold it to the pawn shop, telling himself that Daniel wasn't coming back, that the watch couldn't matter anymore. He'd been living with that guilt for 3 years. The tattoo, Endure, had been his reminder of the weight he carried, the secret he couldn't tell, the friend he'd failed. Detective Santos told the Hales that they were still investigating Marcus Lee's story, still trying to verify what they could. But she also said gently that in her experience, the story had the ring of truth. Young people did sometimes disappear voluntarily when they felt threatened. And 3 years of Daniel's digital footprint being completely silent suggested either death or deliberate disappearance, and they had no evidence of the former. Sophie met the Hales one last time, 2 weeks later, at a quiet coffee shop in Queens. They looked different, older, but also somehow lighter, as if certainty, even terrible certainty, weighed less than the not knowing. "We've hired a firm that specializes in finding people who don't want to be found," Marcus said. "If Daniel's alive somewhere, if he's hiding, we'll find him. And if we can't, at least we know he chose this, that he wasn't taken from us, that somewhere, maybe, he's still making the world better in ways we can't see." Evelyn handed Sophie an envelope. Inside was a check for $50,000. For your college fund,
for your brother's college fund, for whatever you need. You gave us something we'd lost. Not our son, not yet, but hope. The real kind. The kind we can build on. Sophie tried to refuse, but Evelyn folded her hands over Sophie's. You've taught us something, she said softly, that ordinary people doing ordinary kindness can change everything. That caring matters, that showing up matters. Let us do this one thing that matters to us. Sophie took the check. She kept the watch, too, at Marcus's insistence. Daniel would want someone to wear it who understands its value. Not the monetary value, the value of time, of family, of hope. As Sophie walked home through the city that evening, she thought about how everyone was fighting invisible battles, carrying invisible weights. She thought about Daniel Hale, wherever he was, and she hoped he'd found peace. She thought about Marcus Lee, enduring. She thought about families fractured and families whole, and how love was both the thing that broke you and the thing that held you together. The watch ticked on her wrist, steady and certain, marking moments that became minutes, that became a life. And Sophie Martinez, 23 years old, carrying other people's stories alongside her own, kept walking forward into whatever came next. Thank you for listening to The Weight of Time. If this story moved you, please consider subscribing to our channel for more compelling narratives that explore the complexity of human connection, loss, and hope. We publish new stories every week, each one carefully crafted to make you think, feel, and see the world a little differently. Hit the subscribe button, turn on notifications, and share this story with someone who appreciates thoughtful, emotionally resonant storytelling. Your support helps us continue creating content that matters.